Part 1, America Rise. Jimmy Morris. Less stress matters. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati, this episode is being dedicated to information related to voting. What voting means, how voting works, how the numbers add up, or when the numbers don't add up. We're going to be looking at a number of different incidents and a number of different historical moments in time that lead us to the present day voting. Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati, lecturer, commentator, author, civil rights worker, Black history historian. The Age of Enlightenment. These are interesting times. Black language and culture, new challenges and dilemmas.
I'm Mahmoud El-Kati, and I want to have a few minutes with you to discuss what some people will call little big things or big little things, or however that is. And it's concerning the passing recently of Unita Blackwell. Unita Blackwell. I wish you would go to the computer and look her up. A very important figure in this whole discussion of democracy, trying to achieve democracy. Democracy does not exist. It's an aspiration, as so many other people have said before me. It's not a reality, it's an ideal. And we're still in the midst of struggling for this ideal, which everybody claims and wants. And we talk about democracy as if it were something that's already achieved, and we are actually regressing from this great achievement. I think nothing could be farther from the truth. Democracy is not something that's completed yet. It is not a static condition. It's a process. It's not being, but becoming. It can be easily lost, democracy, and never fully won. And its essence is eternal struggle. Democracy is not static. It's supposed to be dynamic. It's supposed to be discussions and disagreements and so forth, and compromises. And that's what democracy is. And to the extent that it has worked, that's what happened to bring us to this point in America. And in this connection, I want to cite the passing of one of the great freedom fighters, one of the great strugglers for this ideal, who recently passed. Her name is Unita Blackwell. Unita Blackwell. Go to the computer. Look her up. Unita Blackwell is one of those agents in our history, in our recent history, who helped us to get to this point. She's one of any number of unsung heroes in the movement for democracy, commonly called the Civil Rights Movement. No, it was a movement for democracy. The democracy that we have now, I think Taylor Branch.
The most common ad in the want ads, which were segregated, help wanted colored, help wanted white, but also help wanted male, help wanted female. The most common ad for females was Girl Friday.
Branch, the great writer, said, The new democracy was created by the civil rights movement, you understand? Those of us who were born into a segregated society understand what he's talking about. The rights and privileges that many of us have now, and it's shaky, but did not exist.
Women weren't admitted to the University of North Carolina unless they were nursing students when I was there. They weren't anywhere near Princeton or the Ivy League schools, let alone West Point, the Citadel. Any of these places was beyond the pale. And now we take it for granted. All of these things that flowed out of these blessings, that flowed out of the civil rights movement when people started struggling with what equal citizenship meant, it paid dividends across the board for legal immigrants. The Immigration Reform Act of 1965 repealed racial restrictions that limited naturalized citizenship. 90% of the legal immigrants had always come from the nations of Northern Europe. We didn't even want Italians, let alone Africa and Asia. And Lyndon Johnson signed that bill in 1965 and under the Statue of Liberty, and said, "Never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to freedom. No foreigner is too foreign to become a fellow citizen," and communities of citizens from all over the world invisibly have changed the face of North Carolina and the United States, literally and figuratively, to become a multi-ethnic global democracy.
Until the achievements of the civil rights movement, dealing primarily with law, but also morality, which is where Dr. King comes in. So those of you who never heard of her, I'd like to introduce you with just a few words on Unita Blackwell, a Mississippian, which was a critical state in the struggle to get rid of this mean, ugly aspect of white supremacy, and it's called Jim Crow.
This is John and this is Adam. They are best friends. In school, they are learning about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were laws placed in the U.S. in 1877 and ended around 1950.
Jim Crow was a legal system which restricted the rights, the privileges, the humanity of black people before the eyes of the rest of Americans. Americans have a very high tolerance for violence.
The threats are all around us. Politicians aren't there to protect you. Laws can't protect you. But you know what can protect you? The ironclad, absolute safeguard of the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
Well, let's actually hear it from Dana Loesch of the NRA herself.
They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and comedy shows and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance, all to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia, to smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness.
That message from the NRA is a direct descendant of the same mentality that has been a staple of white supremacy throughout the history of the United States. The real Americans need weapons to protect themselves from the savages. Gun rights in this country were forged on the idea that white people had the right to take Native people's land by the barrel of the gun. They were forged on the idea that black people were living pieces of property that needed to be kept in place by armed slave patrols, militias, and posse justice. No matter what your position on guns is, the Second Amendment stems from an ideology that is rooted in the belief that white people have the right to control others with their weapons. As historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz put it, the Constitution is the sacred text of the civic religion that is U.S. nationalism. And that nationalism is inexorably tied to white supremacy.
And an observation of human suffering. That's why it's going on today the way it's going on. We've always had a high tolerance for violence. Slavery was a violent institution which lasted more than 2.5 centuries. Formally, it didn't end there, but legally it ended in 1865. But you had another almost 100 years of unfreedom, shall we say, under Jim Crow.
But these laws became most prominent in the 1930s. Oh, my bad. I didn't even explain what they were, only when they were. A Jim Crow law was a law that legally kept colored people and white people separate from each other. Often the term separate but equal was used to defend these laws. Yet this was rarely the case. Though this is just one example of how these laws were unfair. Let me help you understand by doing a sort of time travel, if you will. Though this may not be a time that you boys will favor. Back in the 1930s, these Jim Crow laws affected just about every aspect of life. Colored people weren't allowed to eat, sit by, ride a train with, or even go into the same buildings as white people. The same went the other way around. Oftentimes, the white people would look down on the colored people, sometimes with pity, but most often they looked down on them in a lower-than-me way. As I said before, the quality of places meant for colored people were most often in worse condition than the places of the white people. There were biases in other areas of life, too. Aside from the bias in what was considered everyday life, there was also bias with the crime system. Colored people were arrested for crimes and charged harsher than white people. There were many bad things that happened to people of color and white people who supported them.
And this person, Unita Blackwell, was part and parcel of this long struggle, which began in the 1600s against white supremacy. Don't forget that. That's what you're talking about. When you say racism, or at least when I say racism, it means white supremacy and nothing else. I've been saying this most of my conscious life. That's what it is. Now, all of the other things are symptoms. They're not really like catching a virus and somebody becomes racist. It's fundamental to this country. It's written, it's described in the Constitution. Black people were not fully human because they were 3/5 of other persons.
One of the most misunderstood clauses in the United States Constitution is found in Article 1, Section 2. Representatives shall be apportioned among the states by adding to the whole number of free persons 3/5 of all other persons. Known as the 3/5 Compromise, it raises an obvious question. How could the Founding Fathers, who endorsed the idea that all men are created equal, also endorse the idea that some men aren't? In 2013, James Wagner, president of Emory University, answered the question this way. The 3/5 Compromise was an example of difficult but necessary political bargaining. Without it, Wagner argued, the northern and southern states would never have agreed to form a single union. No 3/5 Compromise, no United States of America. Many people, including 31 members of his own faculty, vehemently disagreed. Wagner, the faculty member suggested, was excusing the inexcusable. They signed an open letter stating that the 3/5 Compromise was an insult to the descendants of slaves and an example of racial denigration. So who's right? Let's look at the text again. Representatives shall be apportioned among the states by adding to the whole number of free persons 3/5 of all other persons. Note that the Constitution does not say that a slave is not a person. It explicitly says that they are persons. And it also does not say that a slave is 3/5 of a person, as many today mistakenly believe. The 3/5 description had nothing to do with the human worth of an individual slave, but everything to do with how many representatives each state would have in the U.S. Congress. For that purpose, states could only claim 3/5 of their slave population. The 3/5 Compromise was devised by those who opposed slavery, not by those who were for slavery. Or to put it another way, it wasn't the racists of the South who wanted to count slave populations less than white populations. It was the abolitionists of the North. The framers of the Constitution were deeply divided on the issue of slavery. The free states of the North wanted to abolish it. The slave states of the South wanted to expand it. You might say that the Southern slave states wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to count their slaves for the purpose of representation, but they didn't want to give any representation to their slaves. Why did this matter? Let's look at the numbers. In the 1790 census, just 3 years after the Constitution was ratified, the free states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware had a population of about 1.8 million free whites. The slave states of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia had about 1.1 million free whites and 633,000 slaves. Add those two numbers and you get nearly equal populations between the North and the South. By the time of the Civil War, the slave population had grown to 4 million. Imagine how much more powerful slave states would have been without the 3/5 compromise. If 100% of the slave population had been counted, slavery may very well have lasted into the 20th century. Why, you might ask, didn't the North simply insist that the South not count slaves at all? Because the slave states would never have agreed to join the Union. They would have formed their own country, and we would have had two nations, one free and one slave, living side by side in conflict from the very start. The 3/5 compromise was the solution to the most difficult challenge the framers faced: how to create a single country out of people so divided on a fundamental issue. As discordant as the compromise sounds to modern ears, without it there would have been no United States. Following his defense of the compromise, Emory President James Wagner issued an apology to his outraged critics, asking for forgiveness for his clumsiness and insensitivity. As it turns out, Wagner had nothing to apologize for. The 3/5 compromise didn't deny the humanity of blacks, it affirmed it. I'm Carol Swain for Prager University. Thanks for watching. To keep our videos free, click here.
The South fought for slavery and the North fought against it. In fact, the Civil War was the cause of the Jim Crow laws. The reason that they're even called Jim Crow laws is because there was a play where the main character was presented as a dim-witted, aka stupid, black slave. At first, it was just a name of a character, but it soon became a term used to insult colored people. There are many references to these laws in books and movies. One is the book The Help, which was turned into a movie of the same name. In the book/movie, it tells the story of a girl who wants to reveal the perspective of all the colored maids and how unfair the laws were to them. One great quote from the trailer for the movie is, "We love them and they love us, but they can't even use the toilets in our houses."
That's the first time in history where human beings have been both property and people. And that was exercised by power, nothing else. When you have power, you can do what you want to do if you have the ability to do it, and that's what happened, to build a white supremacist society. All of the founding, not all, I'm sorry, of the 51 men, no women, no Jews, no Catholics, no blacks, because that's what the system was based in favor of white men. We're just getting to this question. They were the legitimate human beings. 51 or so men of these men founded America, and slightly more than half of them were slaveholders. Or if they weren't slaveholders, they were investors in slavery. That is, people who lived in the North, sometimes who owned plantations in the South. That's called absentee landlords. It's like any investment you can make today in some business that you've never even seen. So those are the founders of the American Republic, which is what it is, not a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's a republican. It's a representative form of government where you choose people to represent you, but you don't directly participate in lawmaking or anything else. You don't carry out the creation and execution of laws and the judgment of laws. You have people who represent you. That's what republicanism is. I didn't say the Republican Party, but the concept of a republic is a representative form of government. It's not direct democracy. That's to be achieved. These people, led by people like Unita Blackwell, you've heard of some of those people. Lawrence Gouhier, Victoria Gray, Aaron Henry, and of course, the incredible Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the few who got a national reputation, who organized in 1963 something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and had a mock election.
The testimony before the Credentials Committee, the FDP had a lineup of very different people. They had Rita Schwerner, the widow of Mickey, who had been killed in Neshoba County. They had Martin Luther King. Everybody knew King.
The seating of the delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
But the highlight of the testimony was that of Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper who had been evicted from her plantation.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, it was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen.
The president, Lyndon Johnson, he's not afraid of Martin Luther King's testimony. He's afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. And so he decides that the country should not see her testify live.
Johnson is in the White House, and he convened an impromptu press conference.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
On this day, 9 months ago.
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connolly, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy. So he announced a 9-month anniversary.
Mississippi would vote. Thousands of people participated in a mock election, and they did all of this to impress the liberal Democratic Party. And they showed up in the 1964 election, Unita Blackwell and others, so many, Victoria Gray, Arian Henry, and so many others. And then the young people like SNCC.
We stood for a more democratic society.
Nonviolent organizers.
We stood for the right of people to be human. The letters SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We accepted nonviolence, not simply as a technique or as a tactic, but as a way of life, as a way of living.
If I'm in a picket line and someone comes up and strikes me, I'm not going to strike him back. If I'm marching down the street in a protest march and someone spits at me, I'm not going to spit back at him.
People that were prepared and willing to go into hell's fire.
Well, my trouble is hard.
Student for Nonviolent, Stokely Carmichael, Ralph Brown, the great Ruby Doris Robinson, who went to jail I don't know how many times. These young people, the shock troops of the Civil Rights Movement, who did what no other Civil Rights Movement had done by getting into the fields and directly facing our oppressors, and not only that, creating something called indigenous leadership among the black natives of Mississippi. We don't want to lead you, we want to help you to lead, said SNCC. We don't want to take you by the hand. After we teach you these lessons and we set up freedom schools and so forth, you can lead yourself. That's a lesson for all of us to learn, particularly black people. You can teach yourself.
Talk about global engagement. You are embracing it as the future. You're embracing it as a sign not just of goodness, but of strength. But you're embracing something that takes a movement to get outside your comfort zone, to wrestle with very, very difficult ideas, and realize that the promise of democracy is never secure. It rests on the citizens. It rests on the citizens not always, certainly not being cynical. Cynicism is an appetite, not a judgment. It's an appetite, want to have things turn out wrong. Citizenship is an obligation and a dogged belief that you can make a difference as a person engaging with all of the diverse citizens in this world and in the United States.
Each one, teach one.
If only you talk to one another, and listen. Yes, endure the arguments and disagreements and I don't like you and that kind of stuff. That's not what it's about. Freedom that we're talking about is not simply about individuals. It's impersonal. Freedom is about a people, not John Jones and Mary Sally Jones, and that's nonsense. That's individualism. Struggle for democracy is communal. Y'all say it this way, all in. Nobody's out. We need to talk to one another. That's what happened in the 1960s. Listen to one another, argue with one another, debate with one another, and you will reach some conclusions that are pretty intelligent. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is a classic example. Classic. In 1964, a unique thing happened in America. Thousands of students, well over 1,000 of students, came to Mississippi to help in the struggle for human rights. Most of the students at that time that came to Mississippi were white from elitist universities by and large, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Columbia, and so forth. Two of them were murdered in Mississippi. One of them was with a black Mississippian. You know the names if you're good in civil rights history. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Buried to the ground, almost alive, and shot, and bodies mutilated, and so forth. And that caused the national government just what the movement had predicted. If whites were killed, that would cause some human response from the government.
In the summer of 1964, Andy Goodman got training in how to register African Americans to vote as part of the growing civil rights movement in America.
People should be expected to get beaten. They should expect to spend in jail, and it may go beyond the summer when they're in jail, and that they should expect possibly somebody to get killed.
Then, the people in this city are wonderful, he wrote, and our reception was very good. The postmark, June 21st, 1964. That was the same day Goodman and fellow civil rights workers James Cheney and Mickey Schwerner went missing.
They were stopped by the police, accused of speeding. They were put in jail, and they were not allowed to make a phone call. And they were released at night. They got back in the car, and the Ku Klux Klan nabbed them.
The men's disappearance made national headlines. President Lyndon Johnson ordered federal agents to Mississippi.
I asked Hoover 2 weeks ago, after talking to the Attorney General, to fill up Mississippi with FBI men and infiltrate everything he could. What do they think happened? Think they got killed?
This morning they had absolutely no trace. There's no sign of the automobile. They have found nobody who's seen the car or the three people. So as far as they're concerned, they just disappeared from the face of the earth.
It wasn't until August 4th, 1964, that their bodies were found.
Thousands of law enforcement agents for 44 days were looking for my brother's body and James and Mickey. They dredged out of the swamps 9 black bodies who no one had even heard of. Was that it took 2 white kids to legitimize the tragedy of being murdered if you wanted to vote.